A while ago, I was watching one of my favorite shows, but I won't say the name of it because this time they kind of missed.
Ooh, okay.
So in the show, they had a young person go to Kenya, and they were doing a show. Was it Kenya or Uganda? Somewhere in East Africa. And when they went there, the reporter was kind of like insulted that they fed him goat. So he went to this one place, and they killed the goat and fed it to him. And he's like, this is disgusting, the goat. Oh, no. Why would I eat goat? And I'm watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're honoring your presence, you know, having a goat and then slaughtering it for you. They're giving you their most prized possession, and they're honoring your visit, and it's just completely gone over your head. And I think maybe that's where food and culture we kind of maybe misunderstand each other in a way. So I wanted to talk more about, how food is a part of culture. And Anna, I want to start with you. Is food an important part of culture?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, food is tied, I think, to every single piece of who we are, from the food that we eat and the food that we grow to how we celebrate with one another, how we share with one another. I think so much of who we are is expressed and validated through the food that we eat. I just don't even think that the two conversations can be separated from one another. It's just such a inherent part of. They're just so inextricably linked.
But there seems to be, historically, there's been a reverence for specific techniques of, European origin, whether it be French, Italian. Why is there a reverence for these techniques? Joshna?
I have a hypothesis that the reason the sort of French supremacy has reigned is because they wrote it down, right? The French Escoffier wrote down this curriculum for how to cook. And like when we talk about biggest technological inventions, most impactful, the conversations always come back to Gutenberg and the printing press, right? Even though I have a computer in my pocket and I walk around, Gutenberg's printing press still maintains because it's the moment we got knowledge that could move around. Right? So for better or for worse, right? I think there's some problems with the stronghold that French culture has on the way we raise our chefs around the entire world. But I believe that this is it. I tell my students this. The French supremacy here is because they wrote it down. And there's the structure, and there's a literal curriculum to follow for how to teach somebody how to cook. And so other people are like, oh, we'll just use that, It can either be forced on you or you can invite it in, right? Either way.
Joseph, you once mentioned that European cuisine has been using indigenous ingredients. Do you think that should be recognized more?
Yeah, so when you think about how indigenous people traded throughout North America and South America, and then on how well nourished we were by all those foods that were given to us. And I say given because where I come from, we don't just take. We wait until it's given to us so that we can respect it a little bit more. So when you think of when the Europeans came over, like and Spanish came over, and the French came over, and they took all of these indigenous foods from this side of the world to other countries, and it really opened up trade, right? So when you think of Italian, right? So the tomatoes are not even from Italy; they're from this side of the continent, right? I mean, this side of the planet. So like South America and Central America. And when you think about potatoes and then even chocolate, everybody thinks that it's Swiss chocolate or it's French chocolate, right? It all originated from this side of the world. And I think that there should be a lot more knowledge shared within our education institutions across the country and across the world of how can we really define where our food comes from, and how can we pay that respect to that region, and how was that ingredient harvested and used and made a sustainable future for generations until the Europeans and everybody else came over here and ruined it for everybody, I guess you could say, right? So it's very hard to really try to identify with my students when it comes to how can I interpret what I know versus what they can just open up in a book, right? So right? And there's traditional methods of the way we would use a whole animal and cook the whole animal and so forth, versus them open up like a French cuisine book and just say, no, this is how you do it, versus this is how it should be done, and then no, but this is how it's done. And the written word, it's only written by the winners, right? So,
Yeah, nice one.
right?
Yes.
So it's very hard to define where anything belongs, because it's our culture. It's very passed down orally. So right. So our history is a very oral tradition. So yeah.
I just recently learned that China had the most sophisticated food culture at least 500 years before the French did. And I didn't know that. I didn't know what you just talked about. Did any of you know this stuff? Like, how do we not know this stuff?
There are reasons why, right? The people with the power are interested in maintaining their power. And so these are the stories that get told, right? And I feel like it's fundamentally dangerous. Because yeah, because what the result now is that I, as a person of Indian origin myself, are teaching my students, who themselves are also non-European links. I'm spending all this time walking them through European techniques to cook food that none of us eat, right? And there is an oppression of sorts with the forcing of learning these things, right? Like, we have to learn. I always say that as a cook, as an Indian person here in this place, as a chef, I had to prove my souffle before people took my biryani seriously. Right? I have to show that I can play the French game. Everyone's like, once people hear that I've been trained, they're like, oh, but you're French trained. And then then it's like, oh, well, okay, we'll entertain. Nobody, if I just was like my grandmother taught me how to cook and I was steeped in beautiful oral, and tradition, people will be not that excited at all. But once they've heard that I've had French training, then somehow that's going to make the biryani taste better?
It makes me think of, do you remember Khalees, the singer? My milkshake brings out. She's a chef now. She went to Cordon Bleu.
For real, that's
but
great.
when people learned that that's what she learned, they were like, oh, you can actually cook. But Marie?
I was going to say, and going back to what you're saying as well, is how we prepare our food and how we serve it is also linked to culture as well. Like, we did wedding catering for years, and it was interesting to see the shift that happened when Pinterest kind of got critical mass. We went from everyone wanted plating or buffet to all of a sudden family style. Everyone wanted these opulent, beautiful dining tablescapes, and they wanted the 16 plates in the middle, and they wanted the look. But then they didn't understand that the food that works best for that isn't the little tiny, right? It is more of those beautiful cuisines that are going to get better as they sit, as the stews and so there was kind of that discussion around, like, well, you're looking for this fine dining look in the food, but you're obsessed with this look and style that's going to actually they're not going to work well together. So even just explaining to people, it's out of context,
right?
Yeah, because certain cultures, of course, will eat differently. And just understanding what that looks like. But people just really, they liked what they liked, and you had to sort of re-educate them on where that came from.
And you mentioned in our first conversation that you used to go to McDonald's a lot. When
I wouldn't say a lot.
Well, I mean, it was a happy memory for you, because my daughter, when she was 3, every time we passed by McDonald's, she'd be like, McDonald's! I was like, okay, I'm failing as a parent. Or maybe I'm succeeding as a parent, because as a kid, I wanted McDonald's. But, if food and culture are connected, what does fast food say about culture, for example?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it says a lot. I think the timing within history of when fast food really became popular, right around the same time when you had families with 2 parents working out of the household. You had suddenly, a busy mom and dad. You had a household. You had the popularity of cars.
The advent of
yes, the advent of drive-thrus, all of those things. So I think, yeah, absolutely, food is an expression of history as well as culture. To Marie, your point about social media and Pinterest, I think that even now we're seeing as as different social media platforms become popular, so from Pinterest to Instagram and now to TikTok, even within that evolution, we're seeing big changes in food and how people eat and what kinds of foods are popular. You know, Pinterest and Instagram, very much visual, very much about having that overhead shot or that perfect kind of beauty shot, perfect plate. Whereas with TikTok, you know, it's video, it's much more interactive, it's much more kind of cooking at home. And I just really think it's so interesting to see how our food and the way that you know, what we eat is an expression of just the world around us.
Yeah, you can't bust out your tweezers for every cuisine, right? For every meal. And it doesn't mean that it isn't delicious. What is it? The ugly yummy.
Ugly delicious?
Ugly delicious.
Yes. Yeah.
I was like, it doesn't look good.
Yeah.
But it's
tastes great.
delicious, I promise you. You know, get that little ring of oil around the, you know it's gonna be.
You know that it was cooked properly.
We don't have to wipe that, chef. We can just leave it there as evidence, yes.
And it's not even just the food trends, but it's also the way that, because these are global platforms and because these images are like instantly bounced to every corner of the globe, it also creates almost this flattening of food culture all around the world. So it doesn't matter where you are now, if you travel to, you know, New York City or Stockholm or wherever you are, you're gonna find espresso martinis, you're gonna find, you know, sushi burritos, you're gonna find whatever. The trends are all the same.
That globalization of food.
super
But it also
interesting.
kind of feels a little bit like what you were talking about earlier with the lunchbox experience, like pulling out your lunch. So now we're pulling out our lunch digitally.
Yes.
And we're showing everyone what we're eating. And then we're being followed or liked or commented on based on what it is we're sharing. And is it share worthy? And we're not focusing on how did that meal make us feel, who are we with, all of that other sense of belonging that comes from that meal. We're just focusing on what it looks like.
What about street food? Because if you've been anywhere,
But here,
if you're in your car, someone's knocking on your window,
Yeah.
sticking food in the window.
The best.
Yeah. What about street food?
I love it. I think it is such an integral part of culture and food culture. It is like the perfect kind of union of those two ideas, right? I loved and traveling quite literally anywhere but here is a real sadness because we have the potential to have some of the best, like if you imagine, right? All the global cultures killing it on the streets, it could be amazing.
But why does street food feel different from like fast food?
There's an authenticity and it's slightly more wholesome. I think. I don't think that the industrial food system has necessarily had its way as wholeheartedly with street food as it as global franchise fast food, right? I think that is a entirely processed effort. And not to say that that doesn't happen with street food vendors, but there is something about one craftsperson out there on the road making one thing their way. Right? It's mesmerizing, especially the efficiency and the process. The cook inside of me is like, I'm thinking about food handling and how many ladles and what all of it's like, that would never fly over here, but I want to eat it right now, you know?
Joseph?
Oh yeah, that's the way it was. I was in New York just in the fall of last year and going back to street food, right? So it was like the chef in me, like I was walking down the street and my mind was like, I'm gonna go get a New York slice of pizza. Well, since you're here, it's either that or a hot dog, right? So, and then I seen this Mexican couple just selling tacos right out of a cooler, and then I was thinking like food sale. My whole chef mind was like, oh my god, food sale. I was like, I was like, right? So, but there was a lineup to get them, so I was like, I'm going. It's a 50-50 shot, right? So
We'll all be in this together.
yeah. So I took it and then I ate it and I was like, oh my, this is so good because they put all of their attention into just that one little taco that you had. I had a taco and an orange soda.
Yeah.
Right. So it was phenomenal. It would beat any slice of pizza or street hot dog in New York, like anywhere. But like you said, it wouldn't fly here in Toronto.
But I keep thinking that because it's like, it's so delicious, right? But then because of the way that we're conditioned over here, it's like, oh, you know, it's
Public
dirty
health
or
would not
whatever.
let it go through.
Yeah. Do you think that just kind of erases so much culture and so much opportunity for us to experience those different cultures and those different foods?
Yeah, I would love to see that just like on any street corner, right? So somebody just selling food out of their cooler, like it would be amazing because you're tasting the authenticity of that person of where they're from, right? So versus you going up to like a hot dog stand here, it's everybody has the same the same.
Same corn relish,
Yeah,
and pickles
exactly.
and whatever.
The same
and
bread,
whatever,
the same hot dog, the same sausage. It all comes from the same place. So,
Right.
but if you want to get that level of authenticity, it should come from a person that is from that background, right? So, and I think that's very important. It's like I wouldn't go to, for better, I wouldn't eat, like let's just say Japanese food off of a Mexican cook, right? Right. So because there's not that connection there, right? They're worlds apart. Versus if I were to have like really good sushi or really good Mexican food or really good indigenous food, I would go to the place where it originates from, or the person who originates from that area. And like,
But what about fusion? Does that then, do we miss an opportunity to experience that?
no, I think it opens up the doors to more conversation, fusion food, right? So, and it opens up the doors to, let's say if I'm doing indigenous food, I find using French techniques goes really well just because of the really strong flavors of wild meat and the really strong flavors of forage ingredients like your evergreens and so forth. It's like,
We're going to talk more about that in the next segment. We also hear of certain foods being called refined, rustic. Do you think that alters our perception of the food we eat?
Absolutely. The language that we use to describe and to talk about food, I think, is so, so important. And I know you guys were talking about fusion, and I think the idea of fusion, this idea of bringing together cultures in different dishes and sharing and borrowing ideas, I think that is very cool. But I think the actual word fusion, for a lot of reasons, has fallen out of fashion, partly because a lot of, I think when we think fusion, we think of like the late 90s, early aughts, kind of, there was a lot of Asian fusion back then. And a reason why it's become so unfashionable is because a lot of it was done really kind of clumsily, really thoughtlessly, without a lot of kind of a deep appreciation or even knowledge of the cultures. And then beyond that, I think the language that was used was really, really harmful. We heard a lot of language like refined or upscale, elevated Asian, as if this was a cuisine that, inherently needed rescuing, and that the way to do it was through, mixing it with French cuisine or whatever else. And so I just think that if we were all a little bit more thoughtful about the way that we talk about food, it would go a really, really long way.
What do you think, Joseph?
For this whole conversation, this whole conversation is very eye-opening to me because I'm getting a lot of feedback from, and just a lot of open-ended discussion, right? So you don't get that a lot, especially these days, right? These days, a lot of people are just like, I shouldn't say that, or I shouldn't say this, right? So I might get blacklisted if I do this kind of thing, right? But a lot of people tell me how to talk and all that stuff, and you shouldn't say this, but I was like, then I'm not being myself. I'm not representing myself as authentically as possible. So, and I think that is there, as well as me representing myself as culturally as possible, especially in foods and my traditional values that I have towards the indigenous food system. It runs very deep. All right, so like when I was in Pokagon, Michigan, and this was an eye-opening experience. This was a turning point in my career, really switching away from French fusion and indigenous food to just solely focusing on indigenous foods. I went there, me and my son, my wife was on vacation down in Mexico, and we had this whole conversation of, she was in Mexico, she was talking to some Aztec elders. I was sitting there talking to elders in Pokagon, Michigan. They were talking about the three sisters, and the whole stories were just identical. Right?
that's gorgeous.
Versus, because then that's when I was like, there's something here. There's a whole disconnect that
Can you
we
explain
don't
that a
have.
bit more, please?
They, for the stories that they had in Mexico and the stories that we have up here were all identical, right? Of the same foundation of the traditions of the corns, beans, and squash were identical. And then I started connecting the dots, and then me and my son, we ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I had a snack, but we ate all our traditional foods for 4 days straight. And I lost like 15 pounds. I left full, I left satisfied, I was happy. When my wife seen me when she got back, when we got back here in Toronto, my whole complexion changed. I was brighter. I was very, and I felt nourished.
How did you feel? I was going to say, how did you feel that you had access to the foods that you grew up eating, and it wasn't like a big deal for you to say, this is what I want to eat?
Yeah, it was eye-opening. Like it felt like my soul and my spirit was finally happy eating our traditional foods, because nothing was processed. We processed everything on site. We had a whole bison brought in. All it was just harvested. We skinned it. We took everything out. They did traditional teachings on the hide, how to tan it, how to use all the sinews and so forth. We rendered all the fat down to cook with. So it was all our own processing. There was no there was no salt, there was no sugar, there was no other spices. We used different flavorings to have like traditional flavorings. We went foraging out on land, brought it in, and that there was very eye-opening to me, because if my body felt really happy, how can I bring that to other people, and how can I bring that into the restaurant? And having our own traditional foods in a restaurant, especially our meats, is a big no-no here in Canada. Like, we can't serve moose, we can't serve deer. Everything has to be federally inspected from a farm. It's either corn-fed or grass-finished, like they say, or grass-fed, meaning finished. Meats that you would get versus traditionally harvested moose that's actually eating what it's supposed to eat and to sustain itself. And you get all those, you get that nourishment, you get that understanding of the whole food system just by consuming what you're traditionally supposed to consume. And I think that, and I really think, and I strongly believe that each and every one of us sitting at this table, if we would go back to our own traditional food systems, and our bodies will actually thank us, right? So, like, Joshna can go back to her Indian cuisine,
It's
right?
a real thing, for sure.
Yeah.
Like it's very heartwarming.
Yeah, we also hear that, religion, belief, and spirituality, like if you, it affects our experience with food. How true do you think that is?
Massively true, hugely true. Religion, perhaps most, right? But it's particularly from the perspective of restriction, right? I think that's where religion plays the largest role in the set of rules about what to eat and what not to eat, right? And that sort of, we kind of bang into each other a little bit, trying to manage all of that kind of stuff. But their identity connects into that too, right? Because it's like, I know just in the context of the Indian subcontinent, the north-south divide is mega, right? My family's roots are northern Indian, but when I remember visiting India and hear people from the south say, I'm from the south, fish eaters. Right, and everybody would tap their head to talk about the fact that they're all so smart because of all the EFAs or whatever it is out of the
omega
coming out of the we're fish eaters. But that is part of them, right? And it's are you one of those non-veg kind of people? You know what I mean? And Indian culture is so sweet because because vegetarianism is such a giant part with a Hindu kind of, you know what I mean, and a religious directive, but that broadens to other parts of culture. And when somebody wants to tell you an off-color joke, they will say, "Can I tell a non-veg joke?" Right? Because it's just like, that's how we understand meat. Meat eating is this sort of other, you know what I mean, thing. And I think it is so sweet, right? That's the nuance. That's the glory of who we are, right? And I read somewhere recently that the distinction between the way humans eat food, perhaps to other animals, is the fact that we cook, right? And the cooking is where it's like ingredients, raw ingredients from the earth plus culture equals cooking, cuisine, right? It's what we do is we add the culture to the ingredients, which I think from when we think about bacteria and that sort of thing is one thing, but then we'll see the way that rolls over, right, into human culture and the way we connect with each other. I think that is the sweetest, loveliest way to understand that, right? What did your people do with this, right? Because the earth, the onions, the garlic, it grows everywhere all the time, right? But your people did this with this food. My people did this with this food. And how awesome that we get to,
And I saw you nodding.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, on the question of religion, I mean, I've certainly had meals that have felt like religious experiences.
Right.
Well, you're just like,
But no, I was trying to figure out whether there's a connection between current kind of wellness culture and this like absence of spirituality, and then the way that food is viewed in this kind of wellness world. I don't know if that's, again, if it's a reaction to the absence of religion, but I do feel like in this kind of wellness world, you know, where we're talking about powdered drinks and, you know, food that comes out of boxes and all of that, I do wonder if there's some connection
the
there.
absence of food. The absence of religion, the absence of food, right? And
because that tradition is not necessarily there, or it is our kind of weird capitalist notion to isolate and then build and sell. You know what I mean? It's like, ooh, goji berries, ooh, everything. You know what I mean? Kale, oh, everywhere, all the time.
But it's still this idea of like of through what we eat, choosing what to eat or choosing what not to eat, of trying to achieve this kind of optimized self.
It's true.
Yeah.
I feel like my people's tradition has really been rolled around in there a lot, right? With the turmeric and the ghee and the Ayurveda and all of the, you know what I mean? All that wisdom. I haven't connected to the notion of the absence of religion, but I think you're right on, right? Because then you think about yoga culture and all that other kind of madness.
we'll get into that. Well, I mean, we're not going to get into that.
I'm going to think about that some more.
Thank you so much. We could talk about this for another hour, but that wraps up our conversation. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about how food has changed. Again, thank you so much for being so generous. And Joseph, you can be as honest as you want to be. You don't have to mince your words. We want to know what you think.
Safe space.
Truly,
Yeah,
it's a safe space.
yeah.
Yep. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Namki Wanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.